October 1944, the Philippine countryside just after sunrise. A narrow road cuts through jungle and low hills. Japanese trucks move in a long column, engines humming steadily. Fuel tankers, ammunition lorries, troop transports packed tight. After months of losses at sea, these convoys are lifelines. What reaches the front now must travel by road above them. The sky is quiet, and the sound arrives. Not the sharp whine of an inline engine, but a deep, rolling thunder. Heavy, relentless. A single aircraft drops out of the sun, growing larger by the second. A P-47 Thunderbolt. The pilot does not hesitate. He dives straight into the column. 8.50 caliber machine guns open at once. Trucks erupt. Fuel ignites. Ammunition cooks off in violent flashes. The road becomes a chain of fire and smoke. The Thunderbolt pulls up, circles, and comes back again. By the time the noise fades, the convoy is gone. Japanese pilots arriving over the scene struggle to understand what they are seeing. No formation. No bomber stream, just one fighter, and total destruction. Later reports will describe the same detail again and again. One American plane, an entire convoy destroyed. In that moment, a grim realization takes hold. This was not chance. This was not luck. This was what American air power had become. By late 1944, the Japanese war effort in the Pacific was no longer defined by fleets or decisive naval battles. Those had been lost. Carriers lay at the bottom of the ocean. Fuel was scarce. Airframes outnumbered trained pilots. What remained was survival through logistics. And logistics had been forced onto land. Allied submarines had strangled Japanese shipping. Coastal transport became suicidal. Convoys at sea were hunted relentlessly. As a result, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy increasingly depended on road convoys to move fuel, ammunition, food, and reinforcements between ports, airfields, and frontline units across islands like New Guinea, the Philippines, and Formosa. These convoys were fragile. Most trucks were unarmored. Fuel tankers were thin-skinned. Ammunition moved in open-bed lorries. Anti-aircraft protection was limited, often improvised, and usually insufficient. Fighters that might have provided cover were few, poorly maintained, and short on fuel. Yet the convoys had to move. Without them, frontline units starved. Aircraft sat grounded. Artillery fell silent. Entire garrisons became isolated pockets waiting to collapse. Every truck destroyed was not just a vehicle lost, but days or weeks of operational capability erased. Japanese planners understood this vulnerability. They attempted to move convoys at night. They hid them under trees. They dispersed columns when possible. But terrain limited options, and time was never on their side. Meanwhile, American air power was evolving rapidly. By 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces had achieved air superiority across vast areas of the Pacific. Japanese radar coverage was limited. Early warning systems were inconsistent. Fighter response times were slow. This created large windows in which American aircraft could operate with near impunity at low altitude. It was in this environment that the P-47 Thunderbolt became something more than a fighter. Originally designed as a high-altitude escort, the Thunderbolt found a new role in the Pacific and China-Burma-India theaters. Its massive radial engine, heavy armor, and unparalleled firepower made it ideal for low-level ground attack. American pilots were encouraged to hunt targets of opportunity: trains, barges, trucks, convoys. No bomber formations required. No escorts needed. One aircraft was often enough. Japanese pilots began encountering the aftermath of these attacks rather than the attacks themselves. They arrived too late. Smoke columns marked where convoys had been. Wreckage lined roads for kilometers. Survivors described sudden destruction from a single aircraft diving out of the sun. At first, these reports were dismissed as exaggeration. Combat always distorts memory, but the reports continued. Again and again, the same pattern emerged. A lone American fighter, a short attack window, total annihilation. The Japanese air arm had faced enemy fighters before, but this was different. The Thunderbolt did not need to dogfight. It did not linger. It struck, destroyed, and vanished. And as convoy losses mounted, a realization began to spread through Japanese command channels. They were no longer being hunted by formations. They were being hunted by individuals, and that shift would prove devastating. The aircraft responsible for this new form of destruction was not subtle in its design. The P-47 Thunderbolt was massive, loud, and unapologetically built for punishment. When it entered combat in 1943, it was the heaviest single-engine fighter of the war. By 1944, it had become one of the most feared ground attack aircraft in the Pacific. The Thunderbolt was not designed to be elegant. It was designed to survive. At its heart was the Pratt & Whitney RT-800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing more than 2,000 horsepower. It could absorb damage that would destroy lighter fighters. Bullets that punctured coolant lines meant nothing. There were none. Oil leaks could be managed. Cylinders could be shot out, and the engine would still run. Around the pilot sat armor plate. Beneath the wings were 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, capable of firing over 100 rounds per second combined. At low altitude, those rounds could tear through trucks, fuel tanks, and lightly armored vehicles with ease. By late 1944, P-47s were also carrying bombs and rockets. A single Thunderbolt could hit a convoy with explosives, then follow up with strafing runs that turned wreckage into firestorms. Fuel trucks ignited instantly. Ammunition detonated seconds later. What survived the first pass rarely survived the second. American doctrine adapted quickly. Fighter pilots were no longer told to focus solely on air-to-air combat. They were instructed to destroy logistics. Roads, bridges, convoys, and supply dumps became priority targets. The goal was not just to win the next engagement, but to make the next one impossible for the enemy. In the Pacific, this doctrine was devastating. Japanese air defenses were not prepared for repeated low-level attacks by heavily armored fighters. Light anti-aircraft guns lacked the stopping power to bring down Thunderbolts reliably. Rifle and machine gun fire bounced harmlessly off armor or failed to cripple the radial engine. Japanese pilots who attempted interception faced another problem. The P-47 was fast and a dive faster than most Japanese fighters. It struck from altitude, attacked, then used gravity and speed to escape. There was rarely an opportunity to engage. What Japanese airmen found most disturbing was the efficiency of the destruction. One aircraft. One attack window. An entire convoy erased. This was not the attrition warfare Japan had prepared for. It was systemic dismantling. Every destroyed convoy meant fewer aircraft flying, fewer guns firing, fewer troops moving. The front did not collapse all at once, it starved. By late 1944, Japanese intelligence officers stopped questioning the reports. The evidence was everywhere. Roads littered with burned-out vehicles. Fuel shortages worsening daily. Frontline units cut off without a shot fired at them. The Thunderbolt was not merely destroying trucks. It was destroying the assumption that logistics could be protected at all. And as Japanese pilots began encountering the aftermath of these strikes more frequently, the psychological impact grew heavier than the physical damage. They were facing an enemy aircraft that did not need numbers. It only needed opportunity. And those opportunities were everywhere. Angle 1. Human angle. The shock of aftermath for Japanese pilots. The most disturbing encounters with the P-47 did not always happen in the air. They happened afterward. Pilots scrambled too late. By the time they reached the reported location, the Thunderbolt was gone. What remained was silence, smoke, and devastation. Roads that had carried supplies hours earlier were now lined with twisted metal and burned vehicles. Fuel tankers smoldered. Ammunition lay scattered, detonated, or melted into the earth. Survivors told the same story every time. One aircraft, one dive. Total destruction. Japanese pilots walked among the wreckage trying to reconstruct the attack. There were no signs of prolonged engagement, no evidence of multiple aircraft, just the unmistakable pattern of heavy machine gun fire and explosive damage concentrated with surgical precision. For airmen trained to measure success in dogfights and formations, this was unsettling. There was no opponent to engage, no chance to fight back. The Thunderbolt did not linger. It struck, destroyed, and vanished. The psychological weight of this was heavy. Pilots began to understand that even perfect flying could not protect what mattered most. They could defend airspace, but they could not guard every road. Every convoy was vulnerable. Every stretch of daylight became dangerous. The war was no longer about air superiority alone. It was about presence, and the Americans seemed to be everywhere. That realization followed Japanese pilots back to their bases, where fuel was scarce and aircraft sat idle. They had wings, but little to protect, and each new column of smoke on the horizon reminded them that the enemy did not need large formations to cripple their war effort. Angle 2. Tactical angle. Why the convoy never stood a chance from a tactical standpoint. The Japanese convoys were doomed the moment they were seen. The P-47 attacked from altitude, using the sun and terrain to remain invisible until the last seconds. The dive was steep and fast. By the time drivers heard the engine, it was already too late. The first pass usually targeted fuel tankers or ammunition trucks. One burst from 8.50 caliber machine guns was enough to ignite fuel or trigger secondary explosions. Fire spread instantly. Panic followed. Vehicles tried to scatter, but narrow roads and heavy loads made maneuver impossible. Anti-aircraft fire, when present, was ineffective. Light machine guns could not track the Thunderbolt's speed. Larger guns lacked coordination and ammunition. The P-47's armor absorbed hits that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. The radial engine kept running even when damaged. After the initial pass, the Thunderbolt climbed briefly, turned, and came back. The second run finished what remained. Trucks disabled by fire were shredded. Troops attempting to flee were pinned down. The road became impassable, blocking any survivors and preventing recovery of supplies. The entire attack could be completed in minutes. No escort fighters were required. No coordination needed. One pilot, one aircraft, one decision. this was not a raid. It was erasure. Japanese doctrine had prepared for bomber attacks and naval engagement. It had not prepared for lone fighters systematically dismantling supply networks with impunity. And once the convoys were gone, the consequences spread outward: fuel shortages, grounded aircraft, stalled offensives. The Thunderbolt did not need to win the air war. It only needed to starve it. Angle 3. Psychological. Angle. Fear of the lone aircraft. What frightened Japanese pilots most was not the Thunderbolt's power. It was its independence. The aircraft did not rely on formations. It did not need escort. It did not announce itself with waves of bombers. It arrived alone, unchallenged, and left devastation behind. This created a new kind of fear. Pilots could not predict where the next attack would occur. Convoys could not move safely by day. Hiding under trees delayed movement but did not stop detection. Night offered only limited protection, and even then, delays compounded shortages. Japanese pilots began to feel irrelevant. They could win dogfights, but convoys burned anyway. They could patrol airspace, but the Thunderbolt slipped through gaps too small to cover. The enemy did not need to challenge them directly. The sense of helplessness spread. Pilots described frustration more than anger. They were trained to fight, yet the decisive blows were falling beyond their reach. The Thunderbolt attacked the war itself, not the pilots. Morale suffered accordingly. Every successful convoy strike reduced the number of aircraft that could fly. Less fuel meant fewer patrols. Fewer patrols meant more Thunderbolts slipping through. The cycle fed itself. By late 1944, the appearance of smoke columns along roads was enough to sap confidence. Pilots no longer asked if a convoy would be hit only when the lone Thunderbolt became a symbol. Not of American bravery, not of heroism, but of inevitability. And that inevitability would soon reach its most decisive moment. Angle 4. Technological angle. Why the Thunderbolt was unstoppable to Japanese pilots. The P-47 did not behave like a normal fighter. It absorbed punishment that should have been fatal. It flew through fire that would have shredded lighter aircraft, and it kept coming back. The reason was engineering. The Thunderbolt's radial engine had no liquid cooling system to rupture. Bullets that would have instantly disabled inline engine fighters often caused only partial power loss. Armor plating protected the cockpit, engine accessories, and fuel systems. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced the risk of catastrophic fire. Its 8.50 caliber machine guns delivered overwhelming force in seconds. At low altitude, their convergence turned roads into killing zones. Trucks were not merely disabled, they were torn apart. Tires disintegrated. Engines exploded. Fuel ignited on contact. Speed completed the equation. The P-47 was one of the fastest aircraft in a dive in the entire war. Japanese fighters attempting interception found themselves unable to close the distance. Once the Thunderbolt committed to escape, the aircraft used gravity as a weapon, converting altitude into survivability. From a technical standpoint, the Thunderbolt was not elegant. It was durable. It was violent. It was built for exactly this kind of war. For Japanese pilots accustomed to lighter, more maneuverable aircraft, the Thunderbolt felt alien. It did not dogfight on equal terms. It refused the engagement entirely, striking only when advantage was absolute. Technology had shifted the balance, and the Thunderbolt stood at the center of that shift. Angle 5. Leadership and doctrine. Angle. Destroy the system. Not the soldier. American leadership did not view convoy destruction as secondary. It was central. By 1944, U.S. commanders understood that Japan's greatest weakness was not courage or skill. It was sustainment. Fuel shortages crippled air operations. Ammunition shortages limited artillery. Food shortages weakened entire garrisons without a single assault. The solution was air power applied ruthlessly to logistics. Thunderbolt pilots were instructed to hunt independently. They were encouraged to strike targets of opportunity rather than wait for orders. Roads, rail lines, convoys, and supply depots became priority objectives. This doctrine empowered the individual pilot. One aircraft could decide the fate of an entire column. One decision could erase weeks of enemy preparation. The goal was not spectacle but paralysis. Japanese commanders struggled to respond. Convoys dispersed, but this slowed delivery. Camouflage improved, but detection still occurred. Escorts were assigned, but lacked fuel and numbers. Every countermeasure cost resources Japan no longer had. The American leadership had made a strategic choice. Would not fight Japan everywhere. They would remove Japan's ability to fight anywhere, and the Thunderbolt was the tool that made that doctrine brutally effective. Angle 6. Enemy angle. Japanese pilot accounts and realization. Japan's pilot reports from late 1944 and early 1945 reveal a growing sense of alarm. Descriptions became blunt. Convoy destroyed by a single enemy fighter aircraft, resistant to gunfire, unable to intercept after attack. These were not exaggerations, they were admissions. Pilots noted that by the time alarms were raised, the attack was already over. Fuel shortages limited response. Aircraft were grounded for lack of parts. Even when interception was possible, the Thunderbolt's speed in a dive made pursuit futile. What disturbed pilots most was repetition. The same scenario occurred again and again. Different roads, different islands. Same outcome. It became clear that the Thunderbolt was not an isolated threat. It was part of a system that allowed individual aircraft to operate with overwhelming freedom. For Japanese pilots trained in coordinated defense and formation flying, this was demoralizing. The enemy did not need complexity. Simplicity was enough. One plane, one pilot, one convoy erased. By the time these reports reached higher command, the damage was already irreversible. The Thunderbolt had become more than an aircraft. It had become a message, and that message would be delivered one final time at the moment. When destruction turned into certainty, the decisive moment came not during a major battle, but on an ordinary supply route. Late 1944, midday heat hangs over the road. The convoy is longer than usual. Fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, troop transports moving nose to tail through restricted terrain. The drivers know daylight is dangerous, but delay is worse. Units ahead are nearly out of fuel. Aircraft on forward strips are grounded. This convoy must get through. Above them, unseen, a single P-47 cruises at altitude. The pilot spots the movement instantly. Dust trails, sunlight reflecting off metal, a clear line of targets with nowhere to disperse. He does not call for support. He does not wait. There is no need. He rolls the Thunderbolt onto its back and dives. The aircraft accelerates brutally. The sound reaches the road seconds before impact. A deep, tearing roar that grows too fast to escape. The first burst of fire is aimed low, straight into the center of the column. 8 machine guns strike at once. Fuel tanks rupture. A tanker ignites. The explosion rolls outward, engulfing the trucks ahead and behind it. The pilot pulls up hard, feeling the aircraft shudder as fragments strike the fuselage. He climbs only briefly. Then he turns back. The second pass is slower, deliberate. He targets what survived the first run. Ammunition trucks erupt in violent flashes. Troop transports burn. Men abandon vehicles and scatter, but there is nowhere to go. The road is blocked by wreckage. Fire spreads into the jungle. Light anti-aircraft fire rises, scattered and ineffective. Tracers miss. Bullets strike the Thunderbolt's armor and bounce away. The engine keeps running. The pilot makes one final pass, strafing the length of the road. When he climbs away, the convoy no longer exists. What remains is a continuous line of burning wreckage stretching for hundreds of meters. Fuel pours into ditches and streams, igniting everything it touches. Smoke rises in thick columns visible for miles. Minutes later, Japanese fighters arrive. They circle the scene in disbelief. There is no enemy formation to engage, no bombers to chase, no second wave coming, just destruction complete, precise and final. The pattern is unmistakable. This was the work of a single aircraft. Pilots radio back what they see. The reports are almost identical. Entire convoy destroyed. Attack completed before interception. Only one enemy fighter observed. Commanders question the numbers. Pilots insist. Ground survivors confirm it. The evidence is undeniable. One Thunderbolt has erased weeks of preparation in minutes. For the Japanese air arm, this is the moment when uncertainty turns into certainty. The threat is not hypothetical. It is not occasional. It is repeatable and unstoppable with existing means. The realization spreads quickly. If one aircraft can do this, then no convoy is safe. If no convoy is safe, then supply is impossible. If supply is impossible, then defeat is inevitable. The war has reached a point where courage no longer matters. Only capacity does. And in that calculation, the Thunderbolt has delivered its verdict from the sky. The impact of that single attack did not end with the smoke drifting over the road. It spread outward through reports, through command briefings, through the silent calculations of officers who understood exactly what had been lost. Fuel shortages worsened within days. Aircraft scheduled to fly could not take off. Patrols were canceled. Training flights ended entirely. Ammunition rationing became stricter. Units that had been preparing to resist now faced immobility. Japanese commanders attempted to adapt. Convoys were broken into smaller groups, but this only multiplied target. Vehicles were hidden under trees, but aerial reconnaissance still found them. Movement was pushed deeper into the night, yet delays compounded shortages. Every adjustment reduced efficiency, and none solved the core problem. The Thunderbolt did not need perfection. It only needed visibility. Japanese pilots felt the shift immediately. Fewer missions, less fuel, more orders to conserve aircraft rather than contest airspace. The initiative had been lost not in a dramatic air battle, but through the quiet elimination of the supply chain that sustained flight itself. This was the true turning point. Not when a convoy burned, but when the enemy realized it could not prevent the next one from burning. Japanese airmen began flying patrols with a new understanding. Even if they succeeded tactically, strategically they were already losing. Shooting down a single aircraft could not restore the fuel already destroyed. Protecting one road meant exposing another. The Thunderbolt did not need to appear everywhere. It only needed to appear often enough. Reports from this period show a change in language. Earlier descriptions spoke of enemy attacks. Later reports spoke of inevitable losses. That shift mattered. It signaled acceptance. By early 1945, entire regions faced logistical paralysis. Garrison troops received reduced rations. Aircraft were cannibalized for parts. Fuel was reserved for emergency defense rather than active operations. The war narrowed, not because of enemy assault, but because movement itself had become impossible. Japanese pilots understood the implication clearly. The Thunderbolt had not defeated them in combat. It had removed the conditions under which combat could occur. One aircraft wiping out a convoy was shocking. Hundreds of convoys lost made resistance unsustainable. This understanding changed behavior. Pilots flew fewer aggressive missions. Commanders avoided risks they could no longer afford. The focus shifted from victory to endurance, and even that became uncertain. The Thunderbolt continued flying. Day after day, lone aircraft hunted roads, rivers, and coastlines. Some convoys survived. Many did not. Each loss compounded the next. The system unraveled not through collapse, but through subtraction, and by the time Japanese command fully grasped the scale of the damage, there was nothing left to defend. The decisive moment was no longer a single attack. It was the realization that no future attack could be stopped. That realization settled quietly across airfields and headquarters alike, marking the moment when the outcome of the war ceased to be in doubt. What remained was aftermath. After the destruction of convoys became routine rather than exceptional, the consequences unfolded with mechanical certainty. Japanese supply networks did not collapse overnight. They thinned, they weakened, they failed in fragments. Each destroyed convoy removed fuel that could not be replaced, ammunition that could not be reissued, and food that would never reach the front. Losses compounded quietly, without spectacle. Frontline units felt it first. Aircraft sat idle on airstrips, their pilots grounded not by enemy fighters but by empty tanks. Artillery units rationed shells to the point of irrelevance. Infantry formations received reduced rations, weakening already exhausted troops. Medical supplies vanished. Evacuation became impossible. Japanese commanders issued orders emphasizing conservation. Fuel was to be saved for emergencies. Aircraft were to fly only when absolutely necessary. Convoys were delayed, rerouted, or canceled entirely. Every decision reflected fear of the sky. For American pilots, the change was visible. Roads that once carried steady movement grew quiet. Vehicles appeared less frequently, but when they did, they were often overloaded. Desperate attempts to push multiple days' supply in a single run. These convoys were even more vulnerable. When destroyed, the loss was catastrophic. Thunderbolt pilots adapted accordingly. They learned where convoys reappeared. They memorized choke points, bridges, mountain passes, jungle roads that could not be bypassed. One aircraft could shut down an entire region by destroying traffic at a single narrow crossing. Japanese air defenses struggled to respond. Anti-aircraft guns lacked ammunition and coordination. Fighter units were undermanned and underfueled. Pilots who did manage to intercept often arrived after the attack had ended. The Thunderbolt's speed and durability ensured that escape was routine. Morale deteriorated rapidly. Japanese pilots recorded frustration and resignation in reports and diaries. They described flying missions knowing that even success could not reverse the damage already done. Victory in the air meant little when there was nothing left to supply or defend. This psychological erosion was as damaging as the physical destruction. Pilots stopped expecting control. Commanders stopped planning offensives. Defensive thinking replaced initiative. The war narrowed into isolated pockets, holding on without hope of reinforcement. American intelligence noticed the pattern. As convoy destruction increased, resistance weakened. Ground advances encountered units already short of supplies. Air opposition thinned further. The effectiveness of the Thunderbolt multiplied not through increased numbers, but through cumulative effect. By early 1945, entire Japanese-held regions were effectively immobilized. Not encircled, not conquered, starved of movement. The Thunderbolt had achieved what mass bombing and naval blockade alone could not. It had made transportation itself a liability, and once movement became impossible, defeat followed naturally without the need for dramatic confrontation. As the war moved into its final months, the long-term effects of convoy destruction became impossible for Japanese command to ignore. Entire operational plans unraveled. Airfields that had once supported regular sorties were reduced to empty strips with grounded aircraft. Mechanics cannibalized planes to keep a few running. Fuel reserves were hidden, guarded, and rarely used. Every flight required justification. Every engine start carried risk. The Thunderbolt's impact extended far beyond the roads it burned. By eliminating mobility, it fractured coordination. Units could no longer support one another. Supplies arrived late or not at all. Commanders lost confidence in schedules and timetables. Planning became reactive, then defensive, then irrelevant. Japanese ground forces increasingly found themselves isolated not because they were surrounded, but because nothing could reach them. Food shortages worsened, malnutrition spread, morale declined sharply. Soldiers understood that relief was not coming. The sky belonged to the enemy, and every movement beneath it carried danger. For Japanese pilots, the war had changed character completely. They flew fewer missions and took fewer risks. Aircraft losses could no longer be replaced. Fuel shortages meant training stopped. New pilots arrived underprepared and overwhelmed. Veteran airmen recognized the pattern immediately. An air force without fuel is an air force in name only. The Thunderbolt did not engage them often. It did not need to. Its presence shaped behavior even when unseen. Roads were abandoned. Convoys halted at the sound of distant engines. Smoke columns once signs of active supply became warnings of destruction. American commanders saw the results clearly. Thunderbolt squadrons reported diminishing targets not because Japan had adapted successfully, but because its ability to move had collapsed. The destruction of logistics accelerated every other Allied advance. Ground troops encountered resistance that was determined but weakened. Unearthed and UNDERSUPPLIED. By mid-1945, the pattern was complete. Japanese forces still existed, they still fought, but they no longer functioned as a system. The convoy, once the artery of survival, had become a death sentence. Movement invited annihilation. Stillness led to starvation. There was no safe choice left. The P-47 Thunderbolt did not deliver the final blow of the war, but it removed every alternative. It ensured that when the end came, it would come not as a surprise, but as an inevitability already lived through months of isolation and deprivation. The war's conclusion was written not only in surrender documents, but in burned-out roads stretching across the Pacific Islands. And those roads told the same story. Everywhere, one aircraft had been enough because the system it attacked could not endure sustained pressure. Wars are often remembered through moments of confrontation, dogfights in the sky, clashes of armor, landings under fire. But the wars that end are rarely decided by those moments alone. They are decided by what follows them. Movement. Supply. Entrance. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt in the Pacific is not one of heroism measured by kill counts or dramatic duels. It is a story about pressure applied steadily, relentlessly, and intelligently. One aircraft destroying a convoy was shocking, but the shock mattered less than the repetition, day after day. Lone Thunderbolts hunted roads and rivers. They did not need to fight the enemy directly. They dismantled the conditions that allowed the enemy to fight at all. For Japanese pilots, this was the most devastating realization of the war. They were not being outflown. They were being outlasted. Their skill in the air could not compensate for empty fuel tanks, grounded aircraft, and units cut off from resupply. The Thunderbolt represented a shift in warfare. Power was no longer defined solely by numbers or courage. It was defined by the ability to project force continuously, without exhausting the system behind it. The United States could afford to lose aircraft, replace fuel, train pilots, and keep pressure constant. Japan could not. That imbalance decided the outcome long before surrender was signed. The convoy erased by a single P-47 was not an anomaly. It was a demonstration of how modern war punishes systems that cannot sustain themselves under attack. In the end, the Thunderbolt did not need to be everywhere. It only needed to appear often enough to make movement impossible and hope unsustainable. When Japanese pilots looked down at burned-out roads and empty airfield, they were seeing more than wreckage. They were seeing the limits of endurance laid bare. The war was not lost in the sky alone. It was lost in the silence that followed when engines could no longer start, convoys no longer moved, and the outcome became undeniable. That is how wars truly end. Not with a single blow, but with the quiet certainty that there are no options left.